Greetings and welcome back to room 303, Freshman English. We are in the MyPerspectives volume number, page number 152 and following. We're working with Nancy Sherman's The Moral Logic of Survivor Guilt. I'm with you on page 153 for some background information. Let's start taking a few notes. Traumatic events take a toll on the physical and mental well-being of the individuals who must endure them. Survivors of the Holocaust, rescue workers, war veterans, for example, might wonder how they were able to make it out alive when others did not. The term survivor guilt, a term we used in our study, obviously, of Seventh Man, is used to describe these feelings. So we're going to be now spending a little time with this understanding. Now let's learn a little bit about Nancy Sherman on page 152. She was born in 1951. Always wanted to understand more about what her father went through as a soldier during World War II. Her opportunity came when she served as the first distinguished chair in ethics at the U.S. Naval Academy from 1997 to 99. Sherman is now a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. Her research includes military ethics, the history of moral philosophy, and moral psychology. Let's now turn to page 153. Let's pay attention now. This is again an editorial. That is to say, we're going to have a certain kind of argument that will be presented. What do good readers do? We scan the text before we read it. Notice we've got some 16 paragraphs that we'll be looking at, so this is not as long of a reading. We want to pay very close attention, obviously, to some of the questions that are going to appear here in the blue ink, or the comments that are going to appear in the blue ink. So let's go ahead now, annotate as we go. We'll come back to work levels 2 and 3 after we're finished.
The Moral Logic of Survivor Guilt. Nancy Sherman. If there's one thing we have learned from returning war veterans, especially those of the last decade, it's that the emotional reality of the soldier at home is often at odds with that of the civilian public they left behind. And while friends and families of returning service members may be experiencing gratefulness or relief this holiday, many of those they've welcomed home are likely struggling with other emotions. Is the sense of responsibility soldiers feel toward each other irrational? High on that list of emotions is guilt. Soldiers often carry this burden home, survivor guilt being perhaps the kind most familiar to us. In war, standing here rather than there can save your life, but cost a buddy his. It's flukish luck, but you feel responsible. The guilt begins an endless loop of counterfactuals, thoughts that you could have or should have done otherwise, though in fact you did nothing wrong. The feelings are, of course, not restricted to the battlefield, but given the magnitude of loss in war, they hang heavy there and are pervasive. And they raise the question of just how irrational those feelings are, and if they aren't, of what is the basis of their reasonableness. Captain Adrian Bonenberger, head of a unit in Afghanistan, pondered those questions recently as he thought about Specialist Jeremiah Pulaski, who was killed by police in the wake of a deadly bar fight shortly after he returned home. Back in Afghanistan, Pulaski had saved Bonenberger's life twice on one day, but when Pulaski needed help, Bonenberger couldn't be there for him. When he was in trouble, he was alone, Captain Bonenberger said. When we were in trouble, he was there for us. I know it's not rational or reasonable. There's nothing logical about it, but I feel responsible. But how unreasonable is that feeling? Subjective guilt associated with this sense of responsibility is thought to be irrational because one feels guilty despite the fact that he knows he has done nothing wrong. Objective or rational guilt, by contrast, guilt that is fitting to one's actions, accurately tracks real wrongdoing or culpability. Guilt is appropriate because one acted to deliberately harm someone or could have prevented harm and did not. Blameworthiness, here, depends on the idea that a person could have done something other than he did, and so he is held responsible or accountable by himself or others. But as Bonenberger's remarks make clear, we often take responsibility in a way that goes beyond what we can reasonably be held responsible for, and we feel the guilt that comes with that sense of responsibility. Nietzsche is the modern philosopher who well understood this phenomenon. Das schlechte Gewissen, literally bad conscience, his term for the consciousness of guilt where one has done no wrong, doesn't grow in the soil where we would most expect it, he argued, such as in prisons, where there are actually guilty parties who should feel remorse for wrongdoing. In the genealogy of morals, he appeals to an earlier philosopher, Spinoza, for support. The bite of conscience, writes Spinoza in the Ethics, has to do with an offense where something has gone unexpectedly wrong. As Nietzsche adds, it is not really a case of, I ought not to have done that. But what then is it a case of? Part of the reasonableness of survivor guilt, and in a sense its fittingness, is that it tracks a moral significance that is broader than moral action. Who I am, in terms of my character and relationships, and not just what I do, matters morally. Of course, character is expressed in action, and when we don't walk the walk, we are lacking. But it is also expressed in emotions and attitudes. Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics insists on the point. Virtue is concerned with emotions and actions. To have good character is to hit the mean with respect to both. Moreover, many of the feelings that express character are not about what one has done or should have done, but rather about what one cares deeply about. Though Aristotle doesn't himself talk about guilt, it is the emotion that best expresses that conflict, the desire or obligation to help, frustrated by the inability, through no fault of one's own, to do so. To not feel the guilt is to be numb to those pulls. It is that vulnerability, those pulls, that Bonenberger feels when he says he wasn't there for Pulaski when he needed him. That sacred bond among soldiers originates not just in duty, but in love. In many of the interviews I've conducted with soldiers over the years, feelings of guilt and responsibility tangle with feelings of having betrayed fellow soldiers. At stake is the duty to those soldiers, the imperative to hold intact the bond that enables them to fight for and with each other in the kind of sacred band that the ancients memorialized and that the Marine motto, Semper Fidelis, captures so well. But it is not just duty at work, it is love. Service members, especially those higher in rank, routinely talk about unit members as my soldiers, my Marines, my sailors. They are family members, their own children of sorts, who have been entrusted to them. To fall short of unconditional care is experienced as a kind of perfidy, a failure to be faithful. Survivor guilt piles on the unconscious thought that luck is part of a zero-sum game. To have good luck is to deprive another of it. The anguish of guilt, its sheer pain, is a way of sharing some of the ill fate. It is a form of empathic distress. Many philosophers have looked to other terms to define the feeling. What they have come up with is agent regret, a term coined by the British philosopher Bernard Williams, but used by many others. The classic scenario is not so much one of good luck, as in survivor guilt, but of bad luck, typically having to do with accidents, where, again, there is little or no culpability for the harms caused. In these cases, people may be causally responsible for harm. They bring about the harm through their agency, but they are not morally responsible for what happened. But to my ear, agent regret is simply tone-deaf to how subjective guilt feels. Despite the insertion of agent, it sounds as passive and flat as regretting that the weather is bad. Or, more tellingly, as removed from empathic distress as the message sent to the next of kin after an official knock on the door. The Secretary of Defense regrets to inform you that, indeed, the soldiers I've talked to involved in friendly fire accidents that took their comrades' lives didn't feel regret for what happened, but raw, deep, unabashed guilt. And the guilt persisted long after they were formally investigated and ultimately exonerated. In one wrenching case in April 2003 in Iraq, the gun on a Bradley fighting vehicle misfired, blowing off most of the face of Private Joseph Mayak, who was standing guard near the vehicle. The accident was ultimately traced to a faulty replacement battery that the commander in charge had authorized. When the Bradley's ignition was turned on, the replacement battery in the turret, a Marine battery rather than an Army one, failed to shut off current to the gun. Mayak, who was 20, died. The Army officer in charge, then Captain John Pryor, reconstructed the ghastly scene for me and the failed attempts in the medic tent to save Mayak's life. He then turned to his feelings of responsibility. I'm the one who placed the vehicles. I'm the one who set the security. As with most accidents, I'm not in jail right now. Clearly, I wasn't egregiously responsible, but it is a comedy of errors. Any one of a dozen decisions made over the course of a 2-month period, and none of them really occurs to you at the time. Any one of those made differently may have saved his life. So I dealt with and still deal with the guilt of having cost him his life, essentially. There's probably not a day that doesn't go by that I don't think about it, at least fleetingly. What Pryor feels are feelings of guilt, and not simply regret that things didn't work out differently. He feels the awful weight of self-indictment, the empathy with the victim and survivors, and the need to make moral repair. If he didn't feel that, we would probably think less of him as a commander. In his case, moral repair came through an empathic, painful connection with Mayak's mother. After the fratricide, Pryor and his first sergeant wrote a letter to Mayak's mother, and for some time after, she replied with care packages to the company, and with letters. Oh, it was terrible, said Pryor. The letters weren't just very matter-of-fact, here's what we did today. It was more like a mother writing to her son. Pryor had become the son who was no longer. It was her way of dealing with the grief, said Pryor, and so I had a responsibility to try to give back. In all this, we might say guilt, subjective guilt, has a redemptive side. It is a way that soldiers impose moral order on the chaos and awful randomness of war's violence. It is a way they humanize war for themselves, for their buddies, and for us as civilians too. But if that's all that is involved, it sounds too moralistic. It makes guilt appropriate or fitting because it's good for society. It is the way we all can deal with war. Maybe, instead, we want to say it is fitting because it is evolutionarily adaptive in the way that fear is. But again, this doesn't do justice to the phenomenon. The guilt that soldiers feel isn't just morally expedient or species adaptive. It is fitting because it gets right certain moral or evaluative features of a soldier's world. That good soldiers depend on each other, come to love each other, and have duties to care and bring each other safely home. Philosophers, at least since the time of Kant, have called these imperfect duties. Even in the best circumstances, we can't perfectly fulfill them. And so, what duties to others need to make room for? Even in a soldier's life of service and sacrifice, are duties to self, of self-forgiveness and self-empathy. These are a part of full moral repair.
Now, this is a challenging essay. Let's just say that now. This is a challenging essay. While 16 paragraphs seem a short essay, we really do have a whole lot going on here by Nancy Sherman. However, I want to begin where Sherman ends and work a little bit backwards to make sure that we understand how to read an essay like this. Let's say 3 things in anticipation of our comments here. 1, first of all, this is an essay that we will call a philosophic editorial. In other words, we're going to have all kinds of outside voices that will speak specifically to what's going on. Some of those outside voices are famous philosophers. We're going to get Nietzsche, we're going to get Spinoza, we're going to get Immanuel Kant mentioned, okay? And so, if you don't have a working familiarity with some of these thinkers, and certainly as freshmen in high school we're unfamiliar often with some of these thinkers, then we're going to have a bit of work so that we can at least help ourselves understand what's going on. Number 2, this is an essay that will specifically draw on exemplars from especially military situations for survivor guilt. For example, we can easily apply some of the ideas here to our study and our reading of Seventh Man, no question. Certainly he was dealing with what is called, reference here, survivor guilt. But notice we're dealing specifically with a little bit different situation. For example, in the Seventh Man we were dealing with two young children. Here in our examples we're dealing with situations from war and soldiers, and therefore we're dealing with an entirely different kind of dynamic. However, we ought to be able to make some adjustments and observations that will obviously promote our learning theory, that is to say, connecting new information to old information in meaningful ways. Finally, number 3, we're going to be talking in the end about how to deal appropriately with feelings of guilt that are, more importantly, not really of our own creating. However, we feel responsible nonetheless. So there's going to be a lot of gray area that Sherman's going to be playing with in this essay, because it's not totally clear how one is supposed to feel when, for example, something terrible happens and we're only tangentially responsible or not responsible at all, and yet somehow feel responsible. And so as we step into this essay, we're going to pay attention specifically to this kind of idea. Now, I'm actually going to make the observation that standing behind this essay is a very, very famous story. And while Sherman doesn't directly comment on it, any of us that know anything about that, what we call in our freshman year, the Troy tale, and more particularly the story from the Iliad about Achilles losing his best pal Patroclus, it's all standing here. How does that story go quickly? Achilles is fighting at the walls of Troy in the great conflict between the Greeks and the Trojans. Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors. However, through a contest with Agamemnon over a girl, he decides to withdraw from the battle, leaving his best friend, Achilles' best friend Patroclus, to say, "Let me enter the war dressed in your armor. I will take responsibility for helping end the terrors that are happening because of the great fighter Hector." Achilles agrees to allow Patroclus to wear his armor, but he makes him promise that he will not chase into the battle, especially the great warrior Hector. While Patroclus says yes, he ends up disobeying because he just can't, he can't get over the feeling of power that he has when he's wearing Achilles' armor, and everybody thinks he's Achilles. And of course, in the process, Hector will kill Patroclus. Now the rage that, and that's the opening lines of the Iliad, right? "Sing, O goddess, the rage of Achilles." The rage that Achilles feels is in large measure a form of survivor guilt. That is to say, it should have been me fighting against Hector, and instead it was my friend Patroclus, and Patroclus dies. And he goes through some real anguish in the Iliad. As we will study this in our senior year, it is horrific. Really, it is. It's really sad survivor guilt. In other words, Achilles does feel guilty because he knows that Patroclus is dead because of some of the decisions that Achilles made. And ultimately, of course, this plays out in powerful ways in the Iliad. He will go face to face with Hector. He will, in fact, kill Hector. But ultimately, Achilles has to come to terms with the fact that Hector is just a warrior doing what warriors do. And so he returns the body of Hector to Priam, king of Troy, at the very end of the Iliad. All of that is standing behind this essay in some really powerful ways. Let's go through the essay now quickly. Notice we will begin with the idea of war veterans returning home and the conflict involved, especially because she's writing this essay, as our footnote tells us, on July the 4th, and the 4th of July, Independence Day, will resurrect all kinds of powerful feelings. She then will begin to talk about the endless loop of flukish luck as it relates specifically to terrible things that can happen in war. She will then, of course, give the exemplar of what happened in Afghanistan when Bodenberger and Pulaski will have the kind of terrible experience that's going on there, and the death, and the feeling that somehow I wish I could be there to help save or do something. And even though it's somewhat irrational, right? Obviously, there's nothing you could have done. You still feel responsible. By paragraph number 5, she begins to talk about Nietzsche's notion, the great German philosopher, about bad conscience. In his Genealogy of Morals, he quotes Nietzsche, another famous philosopher named Spinoza. And the whole idea is that there's a certain kind of phenomenon, bad conscience, a term for the consciousness of guilt where one has done nothing wrong. doesn't, she says, grow in the soils, quoting here and talking about Nietzsche, where we would most expect it, such as in prisons, but rather, of course, the people who are not actually guilty at all. By paragraph 6, she begins to think about, along with Aristotle, the great philosopher of the golden mean, as it's called, trying to understand this notion of who I am. That is to say, in relationships of character and relationships with others. And what does it matter that morally I'm supposed to take care of others or not? Sometimes if we don't profess the golden mean, we can go too far one way or the other, either to the negative or to the positive. And in this case, it's obviously that sacred bond among soldiers, which originates, as Sherman points out, not just in a sense of duty, but a powerful sense of love. Again, we're back to Achilles and his pal Patroclus. There is a sense of maybe betrayal, because, notice, always faithful is the mantra, the motto of the Marines, and therefore, if a Marine is lost, there's a sense that maybe I could have done something to have maybe helped. The language of paragraph 8 is significant. Notice often service members, especially of higher ranking, will talk about those below them as my soldiers, my Marines, my sailors, as if they are family members and therefore to some degree responsible, even though luck plays a disturbing part in all of this. By paragraph 9, we're talking about agent regret, a term that's coined by a British philosopher, Bernard Williams, this notion of bad luck having to do with accidents, where again there's little or no culpability for the harms caused, right? In other words, it really isn't your fault. Casually responsible maybe for harm. And yet there's this moral responsibility that one feels. The subjective guilt of paragraph 10 is then addressed. And then by paragraph 11, there's this notion